Are you easily stumped when working with dates in Power Automate? In this Power Automate tutorial, I'll show you how to compose an expression that will return a future date, a past date, how to count the number of days between two dates, as well as tips and tricks when working with dates in Power Automate. I'll cover some common use cases and concepts that can help you build better Power Automate flows. Feel free to skip ahead using the timestamps listed in the description box below. I've also linked a few other tutorials that you might be interested in as well. When working with dates in Power Automate, there are 4 functions that you need to familiarize yourself with: UTC Now, Format Date Time, Add Days, and Ticks. The UTC Now function will return the current date and time in UTC. The Format Date Time function takes 2 parameters. The first parameter is a timestamp, and the second is a date-time pattern. The Add Days function takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is a timestamp. Second is the number of days to add or subtract. Use a positive number to add days and a negative number to subtract days. The last parameter is the date-time format pattern. This one is optional. Use it if you'd like to output a specific date-time pattern. The ticks function converts a date into ticks. 1 tick equals 100 nanoseconds. This function is especially useful when you need to calculate the number of days between 2 dates. Keep in mind there are more functions that you can use when working with dates in Power Automate. However, these 4 are the ones you should familiarize yourself with first. There may be cases where you might need to convert the UTC Now timestamp or a dynamic content timestamp into your local time zone. I'm not going to spend too much time on times in this specific tutorial, as it'll be more focused on dates. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out when I do upload a time tutorial. When you need to convert a timestamp, aka a date and time, use the Convert Time Zone action. To convert the UTC Now timestamp into your local time zone, insert the UTC Now function into the base time field. In the source time zone, search for and select Coordinated Universal Time. In the destination time zone, search for and select your local time zone. For the format string, select Round Trip. Run a test. Review the outputs. The input will display the timestamp in UTC, while the output will display the timestamp in your local time zone. In this SharePoint list, I have 2 date-time columns. One column displays only a date, while the other displays both a date and time. When working with dates and times in Power Automate, it's crucial to know the format of the dynamic contents output. To verify the output of an item, use the Get Item action. Enter an ID into the ID field. If you don't see the ID column in your SharePoint list, scroll to the far right of your list and click on Add Column, then click on Show or Hide Columns. Check off the ID column. After running a test, you can review the output of the dynamic content for your selected item. The date column's output is exactly as it appears in SharePoint. However, if you take a look at the date and time column output, the date and time is in UTC. The Z or Z at the end of the timestamp indicates UTC. To output this date and time in my local time zone, I'll need to use the Convert Time Zone action. I'm going to drag the Convert Time Zone action below the Get Item action and replace this with the date and time dynamic content from above. Run a test. To get a future date from today, we'll need to use an expression. Create a manually triggered flow. I'll be using the Classic Designer as the new designer is still buggy. Manual triggers make it easy to quickly run tests and troubleshoot a flow. Once your flow is ready to go, you can replace the manual trigger with another one. Add a compose action. We'll use this compose action to store the number of days to add to today's date. This compose action is optional. You can insert the number of days to add to today's date directly into the expression if you prefer. I find it easier to adjust the days in the compose action rather than adjusting it in the expression. I'll input 15 in my case. Adjust this number to suit your requirements. Add another compose action. We'll use this compose action to hold the expression that will return the future date. Remember to rename your actions to keep your flow organized, especially when you're adding multiple instances of the same action to your flow. Insert the add days function. The add days function takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is a timestamp. The second is the number of days to add or subtract. Use a positive number to add days and a negative number to subtract days. The last parameter is the date-time format pattern. This one is optional. Since I want to return the date 15 days from today, I'll insert the UTC-now function, which will return the current date and time. Add a comma and insert the number of days to add or subtract. Remember to insert a negative number if you'd like to subtract days. Because I'm storing the number of days in the compose action above, I'll insert the outputs from that compose action. Add another comma and single quotes. Between the single quotes, enter a date-time format pattern. I'll use this one. Run a test. The compose action is returning the date 15 days from today. If you need to use the convert time zone action with your expression, insert the output of the convert time zone action into the expression. I'll replace the UTC-now function in this expression with the converted time output from the convert time zone action. I like to group my actions into a scope action. I call this an action set. This way I can quickly copy the scope action onto my clipboard and use it in another flow. In this flow example, I'm using a recurrence trigger to trigger this flow every weekday at 8 a.m. It checks this SharePoint list to see if there are any invoices due in 15 days. Whenever I use a filter query in the Get Items action, I always add a compose action after to output the total count of items returned. This helps with troubleshooting, and I also use the output of the compose action in the condition check. If there are items returned, it'll send an email reminder. If not, nothing will happen. This is a very basic flow that will send a single email for each invoice that is due in 15 days. If you want a way to send a single email with multiple SharePoint items, check out this tutorial. To return items that are due within the next 7 days, first adjust the number of days to add from 15 to 7. The filter query will need to include items that have a due date greater than today. If you'd like to also include today, you'll need to use the greater than or equals to operator, which is GE. Use the format date time function to format the converted time output into this format. Insert the AND operator and include another filter query. To return items that are less than or equal to the date in 7 days, use the LE operator. If you don't want to include items that are due on the date in 7 days, use the less than operator, which is LT. Adjust this filter query to suit your requirements. Always run a test at this point while you are building your flow to ensure your filter query is returning the items you are expecting it to return. If it's not, or if no items are returned, ensure that you review the filter query. You can do this by expanding your action and clicking on Show More. What if you want to filter out SharePoint items that are due in 30, 60, and 90 days? You might think you have to create a separate flow for each or add a bunch of condition actions to your flow. Do this instead. Use 3 compose actions to store the date in 30, 60, and 90 days. The compose actions are optional. If you prefer, you can insert the expressions directly into the filter query field of the Get Items action. You'll need to define a filter query that will check the SharePoint list for items that have a due date that is equal to each of the compose actions. You'll need to use the OR operator between each filter query. This flow requires only a single email action as dynamic content is used in the subject and body of the email. I'm back in the previous flow that returned a future date. To get a date that has passed, adjust the number in this compose action to a negative number. I'll adjust this number to a -10 to return a date from 10 days ago. I'd like to calculate the number of days between these two dates. In my Power Automate flow, I'm using a get items action to return items from my SharePoint list where the status is equal to submitted and the total number of days column is empty. It's always best practice to filter out your items before looping through them. I've also limited the total number of items returned to 3 while building and testing this flow. If you want your flow tests to run faster, limit the number of items returned. I also have a compose action that outputs the total number of items returned. This condition action checks to see if there are items returned. In the S branch of this condition action, I'm going to add an apply to each action to loop through each item. First, I want to confirm the output of the dates and staff name. I'll add a compose action for each. Remember to rename your actions to keep your flow organized. For the staff name, because I'm using a person column, I'll need to select the display name dynamic content. Run a test. Review the outputs. Group these compose actions into a scope action. Scope action is optional. However, I like to use them in my flows to keep my flow organized and to collapse multiple actions with a single click. Add another compose action. We're going to compose an expression to get the difference of the days between two dates. Insert the sub function. The sub function takes two numbers. It'll subtract the first number from the second. We can't just insert the dates here as a date isn't a number. We'll need to wrap the date in the ticks function, which will convert the date into ticks. 1 tick is equal to 100 nanoseconds. Insert the ticks function. Notice that the only dynamic content available to select from the get items action is the body and value. However, because we have the end date dynamic content in a compose action, we can insert the output of that compose action. Place your cursor right before the closing parenthesis and add a comma. Pay attention to the expression tooltip as it bolds the text of the current parameter you are setting. In this case, it's the second number in the sub function. Add another ticks function and insert the start date compose action output. Press OK to insert the expression and run a test. Review the outputs. Notice that the compose action of the second item has returned a 0. This is because the start and end date are the same date. Next, we'll need to divide this number by 864 billion, which is the number of nanoseconds that are in a day. Click on the expression to edit it. We're going to wrap this expression in the div function. Enter div with an opening parenthesis. Click the down arrow key to go to the end of the expression. Add a comma and 864 with 9 zeros. Add a closing parenthesis and don't forget to press Update. Run a test and review the outputs. The next compose action is optional. You can enter this expression directly into the update item action. I always like to compose my expressions and test them out first before using them in subsequent actions. We're going to compose an expression to output a 1 if the compose action above is equal to 0. Insert the equals function. This function takes two objects. It'll check to see if the first object is equal to the second. If so, it'll return true. If not, it'll return false. Insert the output from the compose action above. Add a comma and insert a 0. Run a test. Review the output. The second loop returns true. Next, we'll use the if function to return a 1 if the number of days is equal to 0. Click on the expression to edit it. The if function takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is a condition that returns a Boolean value, aka true or false. The second parameter is the value that is returned if the condition is true. The last parameter is the value returned if the condition is false. Enter if in an opening parenthesis. Press the down arrow key to go to the end of the expression. Add a comma and enter the true value. In this case, it'll be a 1. Add another comma and enter the false value. If the number of days is not equal to 0, we'll want to output the number of days from the compose action above. Click on the Dynamic Content tab and insert the output from the compose action above. Add a closing parenthesis and don't forget to press Update. Let's run another test. Add an update item action and select your site address and list name. Insert the ID dynamic content into the ID field. In the total number of days field, you can either copy the expression from above and insert it directly into this field and then delete the compose action, or just insert the output of the compose action. I'm going to insert the output of the compose action and run one more test. Let's review the SharePoint list. The total number of days column for the first 3 items have been updated. In this SharePoint list, I have a list of employees and their start date as well as their birth date. This employee's birth date is today, and this employee's anniversary is today as well. The OData filter query doesn't have a contains operator. However, even if you use the substring of function, it will not return any items. Instead, you'll need to use a filter array action. In the from field, insert the value dynamic content from the get items action. In the first value field, insert your date column. In my case, I'll insert the start date dynamic content. Change the operator to contains, and in the second value field, insert an expression. First, insert the format datetime function. Then, the UTC-now function. Add a comma and single quotes. In between the single quotes, enter this date format. The expression will return the current month and date. To prevent the flow from failing, I'll add a filter query to only return items where there's a start date and birth date. I'll also change the dynamic content in this expression to the body dynamic content from the filter array action. Run a test. Although it may look like the filter array action can only take a single condition, it can take multiple conditions. I won't be covering how to do that in this video because I've already made a video that covers how to build a flow to check for birth dates and anniversary dates. In that tutorial, I cover how to send an email reminder 3 days in advance to the employee's supervisor as well as an email to the employee on the day of. I've linked the tutorial in the description box below. You can also click here to check it out. Whenever working with dates and times in Excel, it's important that you select ISO 8601 as the date time format and that your column in Excel is formatted as a date. The list rows present in a table action only accepts a single filter query. Ensure the column name in your Excel table doesn't contain any spaces when using it in the filter query field. If your column name contains spaces, you can either remove them or replace them with an underscore or dash. If you need to filter your Excel data further, don't use an apply to each and condition action. Looping through all rows returned to run a condition check is inefficient. Use a filter array action instead. Not sure how to use a filter array action? Check out this tutorial. When building and testing out a flow that will eventually use a recurrence trigger, use a manual trigger with a date input. This way you can mimic a date in the future or select a date from the past. I prefer to store the date output from the trigger in a compose action. I'll then use the output of this compose action in my subsequent actions. For this flow example, I can easily mimic a date range next week by selecting a future date when triggering the flow. I just need to replace the UTC-now function in the expression with the output of the compose action. Now I can use the outputs of these compose actions in subsequent actions of my flow. Another tip is to keep a copy of your manually triggered flow so that you can run tests and troubleshoot your flow at a later date. Once you've tested and finalized your flow, simply replace the date in the compose action with the appropriate dynamic content. In most cases, it'll be the UTC-now function or the output from a convert time zone action. Instead of inserting static text in your notifications, you might consider using a condition action. However, doing it this way is inefficient as you have to define each of the fields in this action twice. Instead, use an expression. As always, I prefer to put my expressions inside a compose action so I can test it out and troubleshoot it. Insert the equals function. The equals function takes two objects and compares them to each other. Click on the Dynamic Content tab and insert the dynamic content that contains the number of days, add a comma, and enter a 1. Run a test. The equals function will return a true or false value. Next, wrap the expression in the if function. The if function takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is a condition that returns a Boolean value, aka true or false. The second parameter is the value that is returned if the condition is true. The last parameter is the value returned if the condition is false. At the start of the expression, enter if with an opening parenthesis. Go to the end of the expression by pressing the down arrow key and enter a comma and single quotes. In between the single quotes, enter the true value. In this case, it'll be the singular word day. I'm going to use a capital D because I'll be using this dynamic content in my email subject line. Customize the text output to suit your requirements. Add another comma and enter the false value between single quotes. If the number of days is not equal to 1, we'll want to output the plural word days. Add a closing parenthesis and don't forget to press update. Let's run another test. Review the outputs. Now you can insert the output of this compose action into any of your subsequent actions. If you want to convert the output text to lowercase, use the toLower function. Instead of having to manage multiple send an email v2 actions when using an expression, you'll only need to manage one. To check if a date falls on a weekend, use an expression to return the day of the week. Insert the day of week function. Click on the Dynamic Content tab and insert the dynamic content that is storing the date you'd like to return the day of week for. In my case, it's the date input from my flow trigger. The day of week function will return a number: 0 for Sunday, 1 for Monday, 2 for Tuesday, and so on. Why is this helpful? You can use the number this function returns in an expression or a condition. For example, I can use an expression to output whether the date returned is a weekday or weekend date. To compose more complex expressions, I like to use a text editor so I can see the entire expression. Use the expression builder to get the first part of the expression so you can copy and paste it into a text editor. Add the equals function and insert the output from the compose action storing the day of the week. Add a comma and enter a 0. This expression will check to see if the day of the week is equal to 0, which is Sunday. Copy this expression to your clipboard and paste it into a text editor. Add a comma and paste it in again. This time, change the 0 to a 6. Now this expression will check to see if the day of the week is equal to 6, which is Saturday. Wrap the entire expression in the OR function. Next, wrap this entire expression in the IF function. At the start of the expression, enter IF with an opening parenthesis. Go to the end of the expression and add a comma and single quotes. Enter text in between the single quotes. Type in a string of text to output if the statement above is true, meaning if the day of the week outputs a 0 or a 6. Next, add another comma and single quotes. Enter a string of text to output if the statement above is false. Don't forget to add a closing parenthesis. Copy this entire expression to your clipboard and paste it into the expression builder. Run a test. What challenges are you having when it comes to working with dates and times in your flows? Let me know in the comments down below. If you learned something new today and plan to use any of these tips and tricks in your flows, please consider giving this video a like. If you're interested in a tutorial on working with dates and times, drop a clock emoji in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on that tutorial. Thanks for watching!